It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the weekly podcast Film Seizure that you can catch every Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Welcome back to the back end of our Hammer Horror Month on Monster Mondays. This week, both Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing are together again in this tale directed by Hammer stand by Terrence Fisher, the Gorgon. Now let's talk about this week's monster, and I feel like that's the best place to start. We've discussed a Gorgon before, but this comes from ancient Greek mythology and is derived from the word gorgos, which means grim or dreadful. Interestingly, it also comes from the same root of a word in Sanskrit that means a guttural sound, and some etymologists think that all this originated from an onomatopoeia. But who were the Gorgons of Greek mythology? Well, they were typically depicted as a trio of sisters. Some stories handle this slightly differently, but in most depictions of these Gorgons, they were the sisters Stheno, Euryale, and their kid sister Medusa. These women were human females except that they had hair made of living, hissing snakes, or had snakes intertwined with their hair, and they all had powerful gazes that would turn men to stone. The older two sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were usually depicted as immortal. However, Medusa was not. Now, previously on the show, I've talked about the wonderful movie Clash of the Titans, the 1981 version in particular. Even in that movie, which was based on a loose adaptation of some of the myths of the characters involved, Medusa's mortality was a tool for our hero Perseus to use. He was able to decapitate her in that movie, and he's known to be to deal with her the same way in almost all versions of his story. And why and what happened when he did it, though, well, that has many takes and different versions that are passed down through different means. But in one version, he decapitated her and returned to the town where his love Andromeda was, where he used it to save her. Then to turn one of Andromeda's cousins, who was also trying to woo her, because of course, into stone, and was also able to turn Andromeda's father and his entire court to stone. And that last one is particularly cold because he was asked by the king, the would-be father-in-law to Perseus, if he had come back with the head of Medusa. And he says, "Here it is," and held it up to doom the entire court. I mean, damn, dude. But in other stories, it was said that he delivered the head to Athena for her to either present the head to Zeus for him to do with it whatever he was going to do with it, or that she used it to turn Atlas to stone. Now, Atlas, of course, was the Titan that was sentenced by the Greek gods to hold the earth on his shoulders. When she turned Atlas to stone, it created the Atlas Mountains that would hold up both heaven and earth. Other stories had Perseus burying the head at a marketplace or just disposing of it. But as is the case with Greek mythology, lots of interpretations and tales were told about the characters and the various events. Now, one of the more bizarre tales that kind of connects to Clash of the Titans is the relationship between Medusa, Poseidon, and the winged horse Pegasus. Now, all three of those characters appeared in Clash of the Titans, and I guess Medusa's powers either won't work on gods or didn't work on Poseidon directly because they had a fling. Their coupling produced two children. One of them was Pegasus. Now, you might be curious how a snake lady with a glare so icy it turns you to stone and a fishman god would produce a horse with wings. And, well, frankly, I have no answer for that. What's even more bizarre is how Medusa birthed the winged horse. Pegasus was said to emerge from her blood when Perseus decapitated her. Greek mythology is weird, man. But anyway, let's talk about the movie. This takes place in a village in Central Europe that has been the site of several murders over the last few years. In each case, apparently the victim has been turned to stone. As this movie begins, we meet Sasha and her lover, an artist named Bruno. Sasha is modeling topless for him, but we don't see anything. This is a little bit before Hammer decides to go full frontal nudity. But she is kind of pestering him a little bit about getting married and soon because she's pregnant with his child. So Bruno decides to take off into the forest to go into the village proper and speak to Sasha's father about living up to his obligations as a husband and a father. She chases after him only to run into something ghastly, and she slowly turns to stone. We then meet Dr. Namaroff, who's played by Peter Cushing, and he's examining Sasha's body. The inspector who brought the body in, named Canoff, he's played by Patrick Troughton, who we just saw in Scars of Dracula, and as I mentioned in that episode, he played the second Doctor on Doctor Who. Now, he says that this one is not quite the same as the other murders that have occurred. In fact, with this one, he suspects some foul play by Bruno. After all, as he says, lovers quarrel. Later, the police discover Bruno's body hanging from a tree in the forest, and it's suspected to be a murder-suicide. At the inquest, Sasha's father testifies that he wasn't all that surprised by this, and that he thought Bruno was a pretty bad dude. Namaroff testifies that Sasha's death was indeed from violence. There was some sort of metal device that was used to make punctures in the skull. Now, he doesn't mention it, but she's also currently a statue. Bruno's father, Jules, is pretty set on clearing his son's name and finds that this town is pretty shitty about all of this. And he correctly predicts that the coroner will say murder-suicide, thus scapegoating his son as a murderer. Now, Namaroff is a brain specialist at an institution that also has insane people running about and needing to be in straitjackets sometimes, especially during the full moon. Namaroff's assistant, named Carla Hoffman, is kind of upset that the doctor did not bring up the bizarre condition of the bodies of the 7 deaths in the last 5 years. She believes, as she says, quote, she has returned. Before this conversation can go any further, Jules comes to speak to Namaroff. Now, Jules knows that there is something weird in those woods. He knows his son was the scapegoat for murders that were perpetrated by Megara, a Gorgon. And Namaroff wants to end this discussion as fast as he possibly can. Now later, Jules is being kind of intimidated by the locals who want him to leave the village ASAP. He's decided to take up residence in the village in Bruno's home until he can clear his son's name. And they try to the locals try to burn down Bruno's home while Jules is actually there, but they just throw a torch in through the window. Even Canoff, who comes to break up the thing, get those people to leave Jules alone, he kind of sees Jules as an unwelcome guest to the village. So then Jules decides to send to his friend Professor Meister, who's played by Christopher Lee, to have Jules' son Paul come to the village as soon as possible. Later that same night, Jules hears a ghostly singing and decides to go investigate. He does end up running into Megara, but is able to get back home, and he's slowly turning to stone, to write a letter to Paul about what is going on and what he witnessed. Now, Paul goes to see Namaroff, who refuses to give him any kind of confirmation over the condition of Jules's body. The police has also barred Paul from seeing it. Namaroff is having none of this Megara shit. And Carla later goes to Paul and explains that she does believe that Megara is indeed the cause of all this village's woes. And she begs him to leave town, but he wants to know what's going on and what killed his brother and father. And on top of that, Carla was actually sent there by Namaroff to memorize as much of that letter that Jules wrote for Paul as she could. And with what she was able to bring back to Namaroff, he is able to say that he knows that Megara has taken human form, and he knows more than he's letting on, to Carla's frustration, since he could go a long way toward keeping people safe in this village. Later that night, during a thunderstorm, Paul begins to see ghostly images of Megara in reflections. It drives him mad, and he falls down and he busts his head on a fountain, and he's taken to Nemiroff's hospital. And 5 days later, he awakens and is questioned by Nemiroff, who then later reveals that Paul has aged 10 years. When Paul is discharged from the hospital, he asks Nemiroff to team up with him so they can find and destroy Megara. But Nemiroff refuses, and Paul also refuses to leave the village for his home in Leipzig. And Paul instead decides to go dig up his father's body and discovers that, yep, he is indeed a statue. Carla watches from the shadows before revealing that she did indeed read that letter about Megara. She apologizes and tells Paul that she loves him. And she also admits that she knows that she's the object of Nemiroff's affection as well, but she is scared of Nemiroff. But good news for Paul arrives when Meister shows up unexpectedly to see him. It's always good to have a Christopher Lee at your side. And while Paul and Meister investigate what Paul saw the night that he collapsed and ended up in the hospital, Carla tries to find out from Nemiroff whose body it is that he thinks Megara took over. And he refuses to tell her until he knows for sure. But here's the thing. Something is weird about Nemiroff's assistant. Things happen to Carla when she's alone and under a full moon. You see, what we find out is that she arrived to this town with amnesia just about a year before the first murder occurred. Now, she and Paul decide to meet in secret. She says that they should run off together, but they kind of need to do it right now. He says that he and Meister have some things to do to continue their investigation. And she leaves and says that he might not ever get to see her again. Soon, one of Nemiroff's attendants at the hospital tries assassinating Paul, but Meister is there to stop him. Meister sneaks up into Nemiroff's hospital and to kind of go through some of the doctor's files to find out as much as he can, particularly about Carla. And Meister believes that Nemiroff closed Carla's case as being cured of her condition of amnesia, but in fact, she probably is not cured. He thinks that Carla is Megara, in a way. She's at least possessed by the spirit of Megara each full moon, and that ultimately makes her the killer. Now, Paul doesn't really want to believe this, and he decides to send Carla to Leipzig, but Meister doesn't think that she'll be on the train heading for that city. And that night, it's the second night of the full moon, the night that Megara strikes most often. And sure enough, Carla didn't go to Leipzig. She's at the castle in which Paul's father encountered the Gorgon. And Nemiroff is there with a sword to behead Carla, but he's found by Paul and they struggle. And Nemiroff is able to then pick up the sword again and approach Megara, but is turned to stone. She then closes in on Paul while Meister approaches silently from behind her, and Meister is able to behead Megara and a dying Paul, who's slowly turning to stone himself, watches her beheaded image return to that of Carla. Now, one thing I do want to discuss real quick before we get to the three things that I like about the Gorgon. Carla is played by British actress Barbara Shelley. Now, Shelley appeared in past Monster Mondays movies, Children of the Damned and Dracula, Prince of Darkness. Then, she was also in Rasputin the Mad Monk and Quatermass and the Pit for Hammer, earning her the title of Queen of Hammer since she was their top female star during the mid-60s. She ultimately retired from acting in 1988, and she was one of the many unfortunate deaths that were exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. In December of 2020, she went to the doctor in England to just get a simple checkup. And while she was at that hospital getting that checkup, she contracted the virus. And while she recovered from COVID, she claimed that she still felt ill due to other underlying issues. And she would ultimately die on January 3rd, 2021. Maybe not a direct death due to COVID, but one that is likely made more possible by contracting the disease. And it's one of those unfortunate stories that came over these last 2 years of the pandemic. All right, so what 3 things can I highlight about the Gorgon? Well, first up, I love the first act. I like this town, Vandorf. And, it has this terrible secret hanging over it. It's like an albatross around this town's neck. For 5 years, there's been these weird murders. Some people, like Namaroff and Carla, know pretty much exactly what's going on. But the town, they're acting almost barbarically to either hide the truth or desperately try to put it out of their minds. It's easier to label someone a killer than to believe a 2,000-year-old Medusa is running around the forest. You then have people like Professor Heights coming to this town and rightly saying that his son is a victim of their xenophobia and fear in order to protect what he knew better was there. So besides, if this thing is so inexplicable and terrible, it will be difficult for learned men to understand and something that the common folk will fear and strike out against in paranoia. It's just a great setup, and it really, it really kind of helps you actually seeing the Gorgon a little bit later, but it still sets that mood and atmosphere around this town. It's a really great setup. And I also like that all of Hammer's stuff seems to happen in Central Europe, like Germany and Austria and stuff. I mean, that's got to be the spookiest place on the earth if we were to take all of our lessons from this film company. But second, I really like the effect of the victims turning to stone. There are these little details that make it a little more interesting than people just going from their normal color and hair and clothing to being painted gray. When Professor Heights turns much more slowly than the first victim, Sasha, we get to see him in agony as he slowly becomes a statue. He's also got the dark rings around his eyes. It's almost like he's becoming a zombie. And what I also like are the holes in the foreheads of the victims. And it's the same thing we see in all of the victims. And they're holes that look almost like what you would see in imperfections in stone or cement or statues. It's just this cool little thing about the effects of something flesh and blood slowly and eventually turning to stone. Now, thirdly, Christopher Lee, he just comes crashing into this movie and takes the whole thing over instantly. When we see him at Paul's door, he says something to the effect of, "Well, are you going to keep me out here all night?" And before he's invited in, he just comes in and just starts telling everybody what he thinks about what's going on. He goes to Patrick Troughton and yells his way through to seeing the files about the people who applied for citizenship in the village to find Carla's information. He then goes off and then tells the inspector that he heard about the people who tried to intimidate Paul's father and that they would best not try to do that with him. Oh, what's he going to do? Beat the shit out of him? I hope so. That would be awesome. But Christopher Lee is great all the time. But here he's a professor and apparently a street fighting man all in one. He will literally beat the shit out of everyone in town if they look at him or Paul funny. Then he decides to go question Namaroff about having one of his goons try to kill Paul. So now we have some tense Leon Cushing action. He also gets to behead a woman. I'm not all that sure that he's even all that sad that an entire family, one that he was a friend of, was wiped out by a Medusa lady. He's just a total badass in this movie. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next week, Hammer Horror Month concludes with a vampire flick that does not feature either Christopher Lee or Peter Cushing, but has another character named Carla in the form of the luscious Caroline Monroe, Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter. And until next week, stay spooky.